It's the end of January 1917. Petrograd is cold and starving. Revolution is brewing. The 300-year Romanov dynasty is in its dying days. We are about to witness 10 months that will shake the world.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist.
Communism.
The communist.
The communist.
The communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is
Welcome to the
communism?
first episode of Season 5 of the Spectre of Communism podcast. My name is Joe Attard, and we're going to talk about the greatest event in human history, the Russian Revolution of 1917. And we're going to be charting the development of the revolution. Just a quick point of clarification. In 1917 in Russia, they used the old Julian calendar, which was 13 days earlier than the modern calendar. So technically, the February Revolution happened in March, by our standards, for example. Should be easy enough to follow. We're going to put the months of the year on the board so you can follow the twists and turns of the amazing story that Fred Weston, a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist International, is going to help us tell today. All right, Fred, before we start getting into the events of 1917, let's talk about the character of the regime which was in charge at the beginning of the year. So this is the regime of Tsar Nicholas II, Nicholas Romanov. What kind of a figure was Tsar Nicholas II?
Well, it's worth dedicating just a couple of minutes to this because today the propaganda of the bourgeois and the right, etc., is to depict anybody on the left as being anti-Semitic. Or let's put it this way, anybody that shows any kind of solidarity towards the Palestinian people, connected to something else. The Tsar is depicted as this poor figure that went down in history tragically. But the truth is very, very different. It's a complete falsification of history. First, it's always been the right that's been anti-Semitic. In actual fact, some of the biggest pogroms against the Jews took place under the Tsar. Pogroms in which thousands of Jews were killed. And it was anti-Semitism was consciously used under the Tsar to divide workers. Mm-hmm. That is a fact. Now, another thing is, this poor man, the monarch, etc. Let's not forget an event, Bloody Sunday of 1905. There have been different Bloody Sundays, but this is in January 1905 in St. Petersburg. There was a peaceful demonstration led by Father Gapon.
Yep.
They were actually singing God Save the Tsar.
This was a procession, a peaceful procession of workers and peasants trying to carry a series of reforms to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar.
That's right.
They
actually believed if we can get to the Tsar, he will listen to us, right? Mm-hmm. The response was that these people were shot. And there's no exact figure of the numbers, but at least 1,000 were killed on that day. And that shows you what the Tsarist regime was actually like. It wasn't this nice monarch, father of the nation, etc.
Yeah, the way it was taught to me in school, because I was taught about the Russian Revolution when I was doing my GCSEs for British viewers and listeners, and I was taught that Tsar Nicholas was a well-meaning family man.
Yeah. He
meant the best for his country, but he was a bit incompetent, and that was ultimately the reason for his fall.
It's a very different picture if you look at the actual facts. 1905, this huge massacre, but that was the beginning of a revolution. The 1905 Russian Revolution. Again, in the period 1905 to 6, during and in the aftermath of its defeat, 15,000 people were killed, 20,000 were injured, and 45,000 were sent into exile.
I should say here that we have a new issue of our theoretical journal, In Defense of Marxism, with an article dedicated to Trotsky and the 1905 revolution. I'll put a link in the description.
Right. Now, you see, this connects to 1917, because Lenin actually makes a point. We'll touch with this later on. The speed at which the February Revolution 1917 unfolded, Lenin connects it to the experience of 1905. What happened in 1905 is one important question in consciousness the masses have to see through regimes and understand the real nature of them. The nature of the Tsar became abundantly clear to the workers and peasants of Russia in 1905. This experience remained in the consciousness of the masses in spite of the defeat. So in effect, it was a precursor to 1917. It not only revealed the true nature of the Tsarist regime and the Tsar himself. The workers in 1905 built the Soviets, the workers' councils, which will also go down in their consciousness as a method to be used in a moment of struggle.
In particular, the St. Petersburg Soviets was
right.
the leading body of that revolution. St. Petersburg's had its name changed in the intervening 12 years. It's now called Petrograd.
Yes. But you see, it was an important moment because it was a big event which had an impact on consciousness. Now, the revolution was defeated. The regime was able to regain control. But if we look at prior to 1917, Russia, it was a country of stark social inequalities. The Tsar himself, obviously, was at the top. The vast majority of people were living in poverty. 80% of the population was made up of the peasantry. Most of them living in very poor conditions. You had an industrial working class, which had emerged on the back of a lot of the foreign investment, British, French, and others. So you had an industrial working class, which is also a peculiarity because it wasn't the small artisan, the small workshops. These were big work places, big factories, directly coming in with foreign capital. But the workers were living in conditions of 6-day week, 10 to 15 hours a day, low wages, barely enough to survive. This was the general condition of the overwhelming majority of the population. These are the material conditions. The First World War only exacerbated even further these conditions. Shortages, a lot of difficulties, soldiers suffering at the front. All this compounded on the conditions that had been prepared, and all of this was in effect preparing the revolution.
Let's have a very quick aside and catch up with the history of the Bolshevik Party since the 1905 revolution that you mentioned. So Trotsky is the leader of the St. Petersburg Soviets in 1905. He's not a member of the Bolsheviks at that time, and he still isn't at the beginning of 1917. He's been in neither of the two factions of the Russian Marxists, at this point now parties, the Bolshevik faction, the reformist faction that was trying to ally with the liberals, and the Bolsheviks led by Lenin. So what's happened to the Bolsheviks in the period between 1905 and 1917?
Very briefly, there was the famous 1903 split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. There was the 1905 revolution. What happened after that is that they actually came back together formally into one party. And that's because even Lenin understood, as a Marxist, you have to understand that sometimes what the Marxists understand, what the most advanced layers understand, is not necessarily understood by the mass. Masses tend to learn from experience. And the need for a separate party wasn't so clear. So for a period, actually until 1912, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were two factions of the same party. But that was a period of reaction. It was extremely difficult after the 1905 defeat. From 1906, there was reaction in Russia. A lot of the Bolsheviks, all the labor movement activists were in exile, internal exile, or they had to leave the country altogether. It was also a difficult period to defend the genuine ideas of Marxism. That's the period of 1908 when Lenin has to deal with the question of philosophy, combating idealism. His book on imperial criticism is Lenin's fight for the fundamental ideas of Marxism, i.e. dialectical materialism. In a situation of defeat, you get all kinds of demoralized elements emerging, all kinds of alien ideas, and you're really against the stream in a situation like that. It was in 1912 that the final break took place, And it's also a period where the labor movement is beginning to recover from about 1910, 1911. And it's not just in Russia. Prior to the First World War, the labor movement was actually on the rise. And the First World War, when it breaks out, cuts across that temporarily because of the nationalism, because of the war effort.
Yeah, you rally around the flag at the
That's
outbreak
right.
of a war.
So there was, the early days of the war were difficult. But Lenin understood that the conditions would change, that the war conditions would create a dramatic turn in events. And that started to become quite evident by the time we get to 1917. That was the situation. Lenin was in exile, having to follow events from abroad. Even getting information wasn't easy. We didn't have the internet in those days. So he had to depend on, obviously, correspondence from the interior and reading the bourgeois press that was available. The Bolsheviks already had important influence in some of the key factories. For instance, amongst the Kornilov workers, they had a base. And that would become a key element in the revolution itself as it unfolded.
Let's begin with the start of the year. We'll put it on the board. January 1917. You've got huge bread queues. You've got bread riots, given the shortages. There are already 270,000 people on strike, including 170,000 in Petrograd. You mentioned that a huge number of men are being killed at the fronts. The war has been a disaster for the Russian army. There are stories of soldiers being sent into conflict without any guns and being told to just pick up rifles from the dead. They're dying in their droves. But not only that, that has sucked manpower out of the cities and out of the countryside because the majority of soldiers were peasant conscripts. So that means that a lot of the people who remain are women.
That's right.
And women are going to play an important role in the events to come.
Very important role. This question of the bread shortages and the bread riots is an indication of the real suffering of the people, especially in the urban areas. Just a little aside, when they talk about, it was just Russia. In August of 1917, in Turin, you had shortages of bread, you had bread riots, and the women were leading that protest, and hundreds of them got killed. They got shot at by the Italian army. This was 1917, Italy. They were also in war. Similar conditions. It's a separate discussion. We could have a completely separate discussion on this. But it was an international situation that was emerging. And Russia was, in effect, in the vanguard of this process. They were the most advanced. But there was another significant element. In Petrograd, there were already 3,000 members of the Bolsheviks. The reason I emphasize that is the presence of such a party is what is going to determine the difference between what happened in Russia and what happened in Italy.
All right, well, let's move into February. The Russians attempt to counterattack on German troops, but it crumbles nevertheless. Their allies, which includes the British and the French, are pushing Russia to launch a new offensive. And this is only adding to the pressure on the domestic situation. In the first couple of months of this year, there are going to be over 500,000 political strikers, the majority in Petrograd. What is the event or series of events that really triggers the revolutionary process that begins to unfold in February?
Well, there were strikes of the Kornilov workers. But then there's the key, what is now remembered as Women's Day, 8th of March for us. It was the 23rd of February in the old Russian calendar. And there are meetings in the workplaces, what to do. And it's interesting to note the women play a particularly important role in pushing for strike action. They were the most militant, actually. There's a lot of comments about the women sometimes shaming the men, going out and calling on them to come out, and being basically the trigger of a huge movement The women, they vote massively for strike action. And then once it takes off, it's a wave of strikes that unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes an unstoppable process. The women also play a role in going to the soldiers and appealing to them. We're not fighting you, you should be on our side, and appealing on a class basis. And of course, you've got to think, these soldiers, most of the soldiers would have been peasants in uniform. Maybe 80% of the population are peasants. But they suffered terribly at the front. So there was a sympathy, a natural sympathy amongst the soldiers towards these women struggling. It had a powerful impact on unleashing the February Revolution. That's what it was.
Yeah. So Trotsky goes into these events in detail in his masterful 3-part history of the Russian Revolution. I'll put a link in the description to where you can buy those books. He says that on the 23rd of February, the women, against all advice, against the advice
That's
of
right.
the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, they go for strike action. And it begins in a district called Vyborg. So the Vyborg textile workers are the spear tip of the revolution. And within a day, you've got 50 big enterprises in Petrograd on strike, and the strikes begin to spread to other districts. The crowds are singing the Marseillaise, which is still a song with revolutionary significance at that time, referencing the Great French Revolution. I'll quote directly from Trotsky's text. He talks about the women workers surrounding the soldiers and the Cossacks who were sent in to quell the strikers. They screamed, "We have husbands, fathers, and brothers at the front." So they're shaming these.
That's right.
No, these armed bodies of men who've been sent to crush the revolution. By the 25th, 240,000 workers are on strike, and the city is effectively at a standstill. So let's catch up with two of the key players here. First of all, you have got a Duma now in Russia. You, nominally speaking, have an elected parliament. It was one of the conquests of the 1905 revolution. And you have the Tsar. What are they doing in the course of all of this?
They're trying to meet the demands of their imperialist allies, the British and the French. They're pushing for the offensive. They're pushing for repressing the strike wave and re-establishing order and discipline and rebuilding the effort for the war. Unfortunately for them, they've completely misread the mood on the ground. They are moving in exactly the opposite direction to that of the masses. What's happening amongst the masses is what we've described so far, but what's interesting is on the, I think it's 25th of February, old calendar, the workers meet in Petrograd and they actually set up the Soviet. So what's happening is that while you have the Duma, which is this formal parliament of the Tsarist regime, the workers are rebuilding on their traditions of the Soviet. And for people who don't know, I mean, Soviet is the Russian word for council. And when you say, the Soviet, it's the Petrograd Council of Workers. In this case, it becomes also a council, not just of workers, but of soldiers.
It's interesting because it starts quite inauspiciously. It begins on the 25th with maybe 30 workers' leaders.
Yes.
Who declare themselves the Petrograd Soviets, and obviously goes on to be the citadel of the Russian Revolution.
Mm-hmm. That's right. What's interesting is that the protesters are being attacked by the police, and the Cossacks come in defending the demonstrations from the police. This is a significant turn in the situation. It's one wing of the armed bodies of men being used against the other. And it's not by chance that it's the military, as opposed to the police, the soldiers who are showing enormous sympathy for the rising movement of the working class. And this is going to be an important element throughout 1917. The way one section after another of the military, of the ranks of the military, that is the soldiers, come over to the revolution. Trotsky brilliantly describes it in his book when he the scenes where women are challenging the soldiers and you don't know which way it's going to go. And then it just flips. The soldiers come out on the side of the women, on the side of the workers, and the balance changes. He He even quotes examples of regiments that are brought in from the outside during 1917, because the soldiers garrisoned in Petrograd were infected by the revolutionary mood. They had their own Soviets. The Tsar and the others, he's very quickly removed, but the bourgeois elements are looking for loyal soldiers, and they think we'll pull them from the front. And they tell them all kinds of stories of what they're going to do. And instead of these soldiers crushing the revolution, in wave after wave, they're basically contaminated with revolution. They're affected by the mood, and they swing over to the revolution. Mm-hmm. And the strength of the revolution keeps growing because of that, because of the conditions that exist on the ground, clearly.
Yes, and obviously the experience of war and the complete disillusionment with whatever spirit of, national defencism might have cut across the class struggle at the beginning of the Great War, it's now turned into its complete opposite.
Right.
And the soldiers are, having been sent to crush their own people who are rising for bread, these are their mothers and wives and sisters and daughters, they break. And at that point, the writing's on the wall. And not only does the soldiers interceding really swing the tide behind the revolution, the Soviet, sensing that strength and with the soldiers on its side, begins taking over the telegraph wires, all the railroad stations, the printing establishments. So in the space of just a couple of days between the 24th and the 28th, the Soviets becomes the real power in Petrograd, which is the most important city in the country.
That's right.
And there's a really good correspondence sent by one general outside of Petrograd to General Kabalov, who was stationed in Petrograd and was in charge of trying to maintain order. I'm going to read it in full, I think, because I just think it's an incredible historical document. So this is basically a series of telegrams where this guy Kabalov is being asked to report on the situation in Petrograd. So he's asked, how many troops are in order and how many are misbehaving? Kabalov replies, I have at my disposal, in the Admiralty building, 4 companies of the Guard, 5 squadrons of cavalry and Cossacks, and 2 batteries. The rest of the troops have gone over to the revolutionists. He goes on to say, the whole city is in the hands of the revolutionists. The telephone is not working. There is no communication between different parts of the city. He's asked, what authorities are governing different parts of the city? He replies, I cannot answer this question. He's asked, are all the ministries functioning properly? He replies, the ministers have been arrested by the revolutionists. Right. He's asked, what police forces are at your disposal? He replies, none whatsoever. And finally, he's asked, have many weapons, artillery, and military stores fallen into the hands of the mutineers? He replies, all the artillery establishments are in the hands of the revolutionists. It goes to show how quickly this happened, but also how out of touch the Tsar and the general staff are, just how quickly things have turned against them in Petrograd.
The Tsar thought he could just re-establish order, as he always had done. Even in 1905, in spite of the revolution, they were able to crush it. He thought he could do the same again. Didn't realize the extent of the changes that had taken place, the changing consciousness of the masses. And this emergence of the Soviets as a power that actually runs things, administers things, and is elected in the workplaces. The soldiers elect their Soviets, the workers elect theirs. And the Soviet starts to be seen as a legitimate power. Once that happens, the ruling class is in trouble, because once the working class have a body that's seen as a legitimate expression of the working people, which has greater authority for some than the old established institutions like the Duma, like the monarchy, etc., then what you have is what we would call, Marxists call, dual power. You have 2 powers. One is the old institutions of the old state, and the other one is a rising power that emerges within the working class. And the fact was that a lot of things could not happen without the permission of the Soviet.
So the Tsar is in total denial initially. The Tsarina, his wife, initially telegrams him, "Oh, the city is quiet," which shows just how out of touch they all were. But in the end, even someone as boneheaded as Tsar Nicholas can't ignore reality. And the Duma, much against its own instincts, previously it was dismissed by the Tsar in the course of this revolution in February, and it goes, yes, fair enough, we respect the law and we respect the Tsar's order, but in the end, under pressure from below, it decides to take power, and there is a provisional government established.
That's right.
So you have a situation where there's a provisional government whose job is to be a sort of caretaker until everyone can figure out what comes next. And you have the Soviets, which, as you say, at least in Petrograd, is the real power. And you have a tension between those two seats of power. So we're entering into March. But before we finish with this revolution, the February Revolution, what sort of role have the Bolsheviks played in this revolution? Because they had 3,000 activists, but I can't help but notice that they don't assume the leading positions of either the Soviets or in the provisional governments. So what role do the Bolsheviks play?
Well, the Bolsheviks are actually a minority in the Soviets in the early stages. The two parties that benefited the most from the rise of the Soviets were the Mensheviks and the Social Revolutionaries, who had a much more compromising position towards the provisional government that was coming into being. Their position was that this was going to be a democratic revolution, a bourgeois revolution, and the role of socialists would be to support the bourgeoisie. Obviously, if this is the Russian bourgeois revolution, like the French Revolution, who's coming to power? The bourgeois are coming to power.
They're the same position in 1905.
Yeah, and therefore, their view was the Soviets, the workers' movement, the working class, should support the bourgeoisie in carrying out this revolution. Now, the Bolsheviks, I mean, they came out calling for the 8-hour day, take over the feudal lands. They called for a constituent assembly because the provisional government wasn't yet a democratically elected government as in a normal bourgeois parliament. It was, as you said, it was like a caretaker government until they could work out what was going to happen. But the Bolsheviks were a minority, but it wasn't just a question of the Bolsheviks being a minority. I think here we can underline the fact that there was actually, a lack of understanding of the true nature of this revolution amongst some of the leading Bolsheviks in Russia. Remember, Lenin is in exile. He's far away in Switzerland. And what you have is the mass of the working class at this stage, and Trotsky makes the point when he's looking back at this period, that the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries expressed, in effect, the level of consciousness of that moment, which was a desire for unity, a desire for democratic rights, a desire for a democratic regime, and the clear class differentiation hadn't yet emerged. So the Bolsheviks, being a minority, did come under the pressure of this mood. And that was reflected in their approach to the provisional government. This is what emerges. A lot of the Bolsheviks, all the socialists who were in internal exile in Siberia and other places, started to come back to the main cities, and the question of the provisional government comes up, and what position to adopt towards it. Now here, it's interesting. Here, I do want to quote. This is from this text. I don't know if they can see it.
Yep. So that's the History of the Russian Revolution to Brest-Litovsk by Trotsky. Yeah. So if you want a quick summary,
it's an excellent short explanation of what happened. There's under a subtitle that's the class collaboration of the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries. This is what Trotsky says. the Mensheviks, who argued that the present revolution was a bourgeois revolution and could not, therefore, be carried through without the participation of the bourgeoisie in the government, right? He says a natural block was thus formed between the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, expressing both the timid and hesitating political mind of the middle-class intellectuals and its vassal attitude towards imperialist liberalism. He's criticizing basically the reformists in the labor movement, but he expresses that this was the stage that they were at, and it was a class collaboration. The leaders of the then leaders of the mass movement of the working class collaborating with the so-called bourgeois Democrats.
Well, let's have a bit of a roll call of the people who lead this provisional government. So in early March, the Tsar officially abdicates.
That's right.
And the cabinet of this provisional government is led by Prince Lvov, so is led by a member of the aristocracy.
Yeah.
The kind of lead political figure is Milyukov, the leader of the cadets. He's the main
The cadets
liberal.
are a bourgeois party.
Yeah, the bourgeois liberal party. And just to cite a name which we'll come back to, the Minister of Justice is a guy called Kerensky, who's going to play a more important role later on. But if you look through the different ministries, it's all landowners, aristocrats, and capitalists. The Tsar is gone. The property classes. Okay, the Tsar is gone, but the interests represented by this new regime don't look all that different to what the workers have just overthrown.
That's right. In effect, these bourgeois elements are catapulted to power in spite of themselves. They didn't work for this. This was not a conscious bourgeois revolution by revolutionary bourgeois elements. It was the movement of the working class from below, the creation of the Soviets, this powerful surge forward of the working class, which forced these bourgeois elements to step in, remove the Tsar, i.e. remove the most hated figure of the regime, in the hope that by doing that, you can calm things down and regain control and run society along class lines in the interests of the bourgeois and the landed aristocracy. Little detail that's interesting, Kerensky emerges here. Interestingly, he's a member both of the government and the Soviet. In fact, he's presented as a kind of the representative of the Soviet in government. He plays a dual role.
Yeah, is he in the Social Revolutionaries?
I think, yes.
So just in case anyone's not aware, the Social Revolutionaries they emerged as the political wing of the Narodniks, or the Narodnik movement, which was a roughly anarchist, terrorist, petty bourgeois movement.
Peasant-based.
Yeah, mainly peasant-based. It was sort of the first serious revolutionary movement in Russia. The Social Revolutionaries, who have a right and a left wing, as we'll see later, were the political arm of Narodnism.
There's another figure that appears here who will play a role later on, General Kornilov.
Ah, yes, made commander of Petrograd. Put a pin in that name.
He will be an important figure later on. These are famous names, obviously, which will play out throughout 1917. Now, as you said, the Tsar finally abdicates. Now, the question is the bourgeois capable of ruling in this situation? Because the monarchy is finished. What are they going to replace it with? You have this provisional government, and what you have is a halfway house between a genuine bourgeois government with full control, facing a very powerful labor movement that controls a lot of the administrative
Just to
tasks.
throw in a detail about that. So Milyukov, the great liberal, people say that if it hadn't been for the Bolsheviks, that Russia would have been this liberal democracy and would never have suffered all the terrible crimes of Stalin and so on. Milyukov, the great bourgeois liberal, supported the ascendance of Mikhail Romanov
They were trying yes, that's right.
the throne. And he actually said to Mikhail, if you refuse, nothing can hold Russia together. So the liberal Democrats of Russia, they didn't even trust themselves to be able to govern Russia to the direction of democracy. They wanted to have a monarch as a figurehead.
They were desperate to maintain the image of the monarchy, which had like encapsulated, the state, had in the past been a tool to maintain national unity, holding down the classes, but the Tsarist monarchy had been massively undermined.
Yeah, and even Mikhail recognized that because he refused. He actually fled the coup, which meant that the provisional government had to stand on its own 2 feet.
That's right. Eventually, the Tsar gets arrested. They have to really show that they're taking firm measures against this individual.
And the provisional government didn't want to arrest him. They were under pressure from the Soviets to arrest him.
That's right. But I think, you see, I think that at this stage, the question of what is going to be the position of the Bolshevik Party towards this provisional government, it becomes a key element in the period of March in the revolution. I have here draft theses by Lenin of the 17th of March. He sent a telegram on the 19th of March to the Bolsheviks who were leaving for Russia, and also a copy was sent to the interior, to the Bolsheviks in Russia itself. I just want to quote from it. It says this, and this is Lenin. Our tactics: no trust in and no support of the new government. Kerensky is especially suspect. Arming the proletariat is the only guarantee. He's taking a very firm line early on in March. But what we need to see here is that there's a contradiction here appearing between what Lenin is pushing for, which is absolutely no support for the provisional government, and what the Bolsheviks inside Russia are starting to do. Stalin and Kamenev, who returned from exile and basically were running together with other members of the editorial board, they were running the new Pravda.
So Pravda being the Bolshevik newspaper.
That's right. And that's where this there's a famous text which says that the Bolsheviks would resolutely support the provisional government, and quote, insofar as it fights counter-revolution.
Yeah, it's the 9th of March editorial statements of Pravda.
That's right. So here we have a government which has the Soviets to deal with, that have this power. The soldiers are arresting their officers. Huge pressure from below. What should this revolutionary movement of the working class do vis-a-vis the provisional government? Now, the pressure was enormous at that time from the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries. The mood of unity, etc., was to support the provisional government because it's considered to be a step forward, obviously, from the Tsarist monarchy. Lenin is battling even from afar. He writes his famous letters from afar. And while the Soviets are spreading, the movement is getting stronger, etc. Now, it's worth, I think, elaborating a little bit on Lenin's letters from afar, because what is interesting here is the fact that Lenin was putting forward a very clear line, and the Bolshevik leaders on the editorial board of Pravda were putting forward this support insofar as. Lenin had no room for that whatsoever. He said absolutely no support. He warned the workers and the masses against this. But you have, you even had a moment where the Bolsheviks in the interior were negotiating with the Mensheviks.
Yes.
With the idea of unification. Now, if you think about it, if your position is support insofar as, which doesn't change, isn't that different from the Menshevik position, you can imagine amongst some of the party members, like Stalin, Kamenev, and others, thinking would be, there's mass movement for unity. We could have we could reunite. If you consider the history of these two factions, having been in the same party and not so long before, you have all this developing. And Lenin comes out very hard on this. Now, I wanted to quote this. Here it is. This is what Stalin said on, this is the old calendar, obviously, 29th of March. There's a party conference in March 1917. And it's discussing the attitude towards the provisional government. Stalin, in his report, he states, insofar as the provisional government fortifies the steps of the revolution, to that extent we must support it. Stressing must, right? Now, Lenin is on his way back in the meantime, Lenin is desperately trying to get back to Russia because he's in exile in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. Now, in normal conditions, obviously, you just get on a train to Russia, wouldn't you? But this was the First World War. Russia and Germany were separated by the front. They couldn't just travel through. Lenin, and not just Lenin, Menshevik leaders, many of the socialists in exile, they managed to get a deal in which they got on a train, the famous SEAL train across Germany, to get to Scandinavia, Finland, and then finally back into Russia.
And from here is where we get the famous slander of Lenin being a German agent.
Yes.
Well, we won't deal with that in any real detail.
But
Maybe we'll return to it later.
It's interesting that there were Mensheviks on that train as well.
Yeah.
They're not classed as they did what they took what measures they could to get back. Lenin was, you could see the revolution was unfolding. Lenin arrives back, and on the 4th of April, he's at the conference. Mm-hmm. And in his report, in thesis number 3 of the famous April thesis, he starts off with this: no support whatever to the provisional government. Mm-hmm. Crystal clear. Mm-hmm. Very different to the position Stalin had expressed just a few days before. Mm-hmm. He says, we must explain the utter falsity of all its promises, particularly its renunciation of annexations. There must be exposure instead of impermissible illusion, breeding demand that this government, the government of the capitalists, cease being imperialistic. You're basically saying any idea that you can support this government is creating illusions in the nature of this government. We must be totally opposed, so therefore no support. But I tell you, there's something else about the letters from afar. I've got them here. There is a quote. Yes, this is a quote from Lenin, right? In his letter, in his first letter from afar. It was the only one that was published, by the way. Mm-hmm. It says, this is Lenin being very, very clear. Mm-hmm. He who says that the workers must support the new government in the interests of the struggle against Tsarist reaction is a traitor to the workers, a traitor to the cause of the proletariat, to the cause of peace and freedom. Now that, you look it up, Marxist Internet Archive, you look it up in today's volumes of the Letters from Afar, you will find that quote. But if you go back to 1917 and look at the version of this letter, which was published in Pravda, that paragraph is missing. I actually, in the 70s, anecdotal thing, I bought an Italian edition of the Letters from Afar. Mm-hmm. Interesting edition. What I've done is I've taken the Italian, I've put it into the English, marked all the bits which were not published. It was basically edited out. And this reference to anybody who supports the new government is a traitor, it's here, all underlined, is not in the text. Now, there's all kinds of people have been trying to interpret why these paragraphs were removed. Later on, Lenin actually ridicules, let's put it this way, the idea that because it's a bourgeois revolution, we the workers, therefore must support the bourgeoisie. That also is taken out of the letter in 1917. Quite clear here. The line of the editorial board of Pravda before Lenin arrives is one of bending to this pressure and giving some credence to the provisional government. Lenin, in his telegrams, in his letters, is making it absolutely clear that one of the basic points on which the Bolshevik Party stands is no support for this provisional government. We must expose the nature of the provisional government. You see, because Lenin was able, compared to the other leaders, he was able to think ahead. One thing that Lenin understood, observing the events of February, was that this was a workers' revolution. This was no bourgeois revolution. The working class had led and promoted the movement. He understood that, therefore, the nature of the coming revolution, and he always referred to this February revolution as the first step.
Yes.
He's always referring it to the first. There's another step to come, which is power to the workers. Now, he understands that, and he can see in perspective. That is the difference. He thinks, let's put it this way, he thinks dialectically. He can see how the conditions are going to change the pressure is going to build up. The contradiction between what the masses want and what the provisional government is fighting for will become abundantly clear.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, because at this point, two of the main demands arising from the revolutionary masses are to resolve the question of wages and conditions, to resolve the hunger, to improve the living standards of the working class, to end the brutal exploitation, but also to get out of the war. And already the provisional government is dragging its feet on offering basic concessions around hours. It's not improved the situation as far as the starvation of the cities goes, let alone in the countryside. And on the war, the provisional government is dead set on remaining in World War One. But not only the provisional governments, Stalin and Kamenev have the same position. I've got a quote from Kamenev from March. So in this period where Lenin is passing his letters from afar to Pravda and they're all being censored, Kamenev said, "When army faces army, it would be the most insane policy to suggest to one of those armies to lay down its arms and go home. This would not be a policy of peace, but a policy of slavery, which would be rejected with disgust by a free people." Stalin, on the 16th of March, wrote, "The slogan 'Down with the war' is absolutely unsuitable as a practical means." And he puts down the objections from Lenin about moving towards the Mensheviks, whose policy is clearly and explicitly to support the provisional government. He says that Lenin's criticisms boil down to a storm in a teacup. So you can see he and Kamenev, they're coming under pressure from this sort of jubilant phase of the revolution where, there are illusions amongst the masses in this new provisional government, and they're starting to move bit by bit towards full-throated support. And on this point about, we'll support it insofar as it's not counter-revolutionary, it's already counter-revolutionary because it's already keeping Russia in the war and it's refusing to carry out the workers' demands. So this is the context within which Lenin's writing his letters, furious at the fact that Pravda is either refusing to publish them or publishing them in mutilated form.
What happens is that they only actually publish the first letter.
Right.
In two parts. And that letter was brought by Kollontai physically.
Kollontai, Alexandra Kollontai was a member of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party.
She was in exile with Lenin. She brings the letter back and it's published in two parts. But as I said, it was edited. But I have here the second letter. It's called The New Government and the Proletariat. Now, all the subsequent letters after the first were never published. And I mean, by then, I think Lenin had actually come back and presented his April theses.
Yeah, so he arrives very dramatically and famously.
He's there. He's physically present now.
At Finland Station. He draws in on the 3rd of April.
And he makes a famous speech.
Yep, to much fanfare.
But you see, in the second letter, which is published later in the 20s, he says, look, the proletariat cannot and must not support a war government, a restoration government. And he's very, very insistent throughout this. He talks about the need to organize, expand, and strengthen a proletarian militia to arm the people under the leadership of the workers. Lenin is very, very clear throughout this. The April theses, comrades who are listening, I mean, it's not a very long text. They should read it together with other texts that back it up.
Yeah, we'll link it below. Because
the April theses were written by Lenin for the famous conference that he read them out, basically.
Yeah.
And it's basically Lenin here is carrying out a battle to sharpen the position of the Bolshevik Party, to correct the mistakes the leaders were making. And he actually shocks a lot of them. They don't understand where Lenin is going with this.
I just add the editorial notes with which the April theses are published in Pravda on the 5th of April. So this is the voice of Stalin and Kamenev, who were the leaders of the editorial board. Lenin's theses are his own views.
That's right.
So to be clear, nothing to do with us. We don't endorse or stand by these ideas that Lenin's coming back from exile with.
Lenin actually poses, one, the need for workers' power. He poses the question of the name. They had been called the Social Democrats up until then. The Social Democrats, by now, internationally, were the parties that had voted for the war credits and betrayed the working class in one country after another.
Yeah.
Lenin feels the need to distinguish the Bolsheviks. He poses the question, we've got to call ourselves by what we really are, which is communists. And he also raises the question of the need for a new international, because the leaders of the other parties, the Social Democrats in other countries, had betrayed. The other leaders of the Bolshevik Party, they do keep a distance from this position initially. But obviously, Lenin has, one, the power of argument. It's not just that he's this powerful individual. He argues his case, which actually fits the situation, not by chance. A lot of the worker Bolsheviks instinctively agreed with Lenin because they can understand the situation on the ground better than the so-called leaders. In the meantime, the army mutinies continue.
1.2 million desertions from the front in
That's right.
April.
Lenin actually said, when he was speaking at the Bolshevik Petrograd City Congress, he said, old formulas don't apply today. We must patiently explain to the masses all power to the Soviets. Now, on this it's worth also stressing, what does all power to the Soviets mean at that particular moment? Does it mean all power to the Bolsheviks? No, it does not. Because, as we said before, at this stage, the Soviets had a Menshevik social revolutionary majority. And what the Bolsheviks were saying was basically the classic. They were putting demands on the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries. Look, here are the Soviets. You have the majority. You have the backing of the working class. All power to the Soviets was take the power. But it's a way, I mean, I'm sure Lenin understood these guys were not going to do that. It's a way of dialoguing with the masses.
Yes.
Telling the workers, look, the power is there to be taken. These are your leaders. These are the representatives the working class had voted for, basically.
Yes. There's actually a really good quote from an article called On Slogans
Yes.
By Lenin, where he makes this point. I'll quote it in full, I think. He says, apparently, not all the supporters of the slogan, all power must be transferred to the Soviets, have given adequate thought to the fact that it was a slogan for peaceful progress of the revolution. So he's reflecting on this after the fact. Peaceful not only in the sense that nobody, no class, no force of any importance would, in this period, have been able to resist and prevent the transfer of power to the Soviets. As we've said, the provisional government has limited support, the army's falling apart, the Soviets were virtually unstoppable. That is not all. Peaceful development would then have been possible, even in the sense that the struggle of classes and parties within the Soviets could have assumed a most peaceful and painless form, provided full state power had passed to the Soviets in good time. So what he's basically saying is, look, the Bolsheviks don't lead the Soviets, but they are the mass body of workers' power. They have the authority of the working class. So you guys, by which he means the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries, you lead the Soviets, so you take the power. And after that, we'll just debate it out. We'll debate it out within the Soviets peacefully.
That's right. He saw the Soviets as an expression of workers' power. And at that stage, there was still talk of a Soviet government, but in the sense of what? A government of the Soviet parties.
Yes.
What would it have been? It would have been Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries in what is basically a workers' parliament, a workers' council. And because of the authority of this body, and because they spread, it wasn't just Petrograd, it was spreading. Moscow, and they were springing up all over the country. It was the deputies of the workers, but also you had soldiers' Soviets. Then you started to get peasant Soviets in the rural areas. This new power was emerging, and with the full weight of the peasantry and the working class and the mass of the soldiers, you could have had a peaceful transformation. That's what Lenin is arguing
And it's
here.
worth defending Lenin against the accusations from bourgeois historians later that Lenin was this horrible dictator who just wanted to win by maneuvers and force his position through. He was saying openly, look, in effect, the Soviets have won, or ought to have won. We don't need any further conflict. Let's just, sweep the provisional government off the board of history to the cries of precisely no one and get on with debating the way forward.
That's right.
All right, let's move forward into May. So, Lenin's back in town. He's fighting an important struggle to drag the Bolsheviks in the correct direction, away from supporting the provisional government, away from unity with the Mensheviks. Milyukov's kicked out of the provisional government, and Leon Trotsky has arrived.
That's right.
He was also in exile. So Trotsky at the moment is, as I said, neither in the Bolsheviks nor the Mensheviks, but he's very close to the Bolsheviks, and that's known at this point, right?
That's right. Leon Trotsky. He was actually there was a group with a few thousand members, which eventually were all brought into the Bolshevik Party, and they fused. Trotsky's in Petrograd, and he actually expresses that, looking at the different positions that were being expressed, he expresses that the person that he's closest to in terms of the conclusions drawn was Lenin. He understood the nature of the revolution. This is no bourgeois democratic revolution. It's the beginning of a proletarian revolution. In the meantime, the new government that's formed has socialists in
Yes,
it.
the 6 socialist ministers.
Yes, and open class collaboration. It's in this context that there's the famous slogan, down with the 10 bourgeois ministers. Again, that is a way that Lenin has of dialoguing with the masses. He's saying, here's the government, it has socialists and it has capitalists. Down with the 10 bourgeois ministers was basically saying to the socialists, break with those. He didn't say down with every part of the government at that stage. It was break with the bourgeois elements and form a workers' government. It was a way of entering into a dialogue, as I said, with the mass of the working class.
It was a bridge to the mass of the workers.
But you see, the army's in a state of collapse. But Kerensky, what does he do? Here is this figure who comes from the Soviets, is still a popular figure at this stage, and he is working to prepare a new offensive. He wants to strengthen the army, to reorganize it, and to push forward, because he's under pressure from the French, the British, because they're demanding their Russian allies up the ante and get back on track and
pull their weight, basically.
That's right, and do their bit in beating the Germans in the First World War. But in the meantime, the movement which exists in the cities is also spreading to the countryside. The peasants now are starting to mobilize, calling for the land.
And they have a congress in this month. On the 24th of May, the Peasant Congress opens in Petrograd with calls for, I quote, conversion of all land to national property for equal working use without any indemnity. So this is the other big demand for land, dealing with the land question. That's kind of the key to the Russian Revolution, recognized all the way back in 1905.
Well, if you think 80% of the population are peasants working in semi-feudal conditions, where they're working on the land of a big, powerful landlords, then the Bolsheviks take up the demand for the land. It becomes part of their program, which is an understanding on the part of, obviously, the Bolshevik leadership under Lenin that you need the backing of the peasantry when you have such a balance of forces in the country. And therefore, one of the key demands is land to the peasants. But that means breaking with the landed aristocracy, which has 1,000 threads connecting it to the bourgeois. In some cases, the bourgeois and the landlords were actually the same people. They were landlords that had invested in industry. They were connected to each other. Therefore, the land question couldn't be resolved simply by saying, okay, we'll have a land reform. It meant expropriating these landlords. And that's why the Bolsheviks took up the question of the land as part of their program. But in this period, May, June, that we're talking about, the Bolsheviks are growing because of their principled stand of opposition. And again, to quote Trotsky, he says, this is in the text we quoted earlier on, he says, to look through the Russian papers for May and June of 1917, when the minds of the people were being prepared for the offensive, there's a huge propaganda for the offensive, there's almost all the articles, without exception, in all the official and semi-official organs were directed against the Bolsheviks. Because of the principled stand and the firm stand that now Lenin had established as the position of the party, because they were against the war, they were seen as the enemy within. And they were seen as a hugely disturbing factor, let's put it, in the plans of the bourgeois, which would be, if it had been for the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, with the socialist ministers in the government, they were collaborating. They would have collaborated, and they did collaborate, in the idea of the offensive, national unity, all the rest of it. But you had this annoying party called the Bolshevik Party, which was a minority, but a well-known minority. It wasn't a tiny little group. It had important positions in the Soviets. It had important party leaders. They were a point of reference for the workers and the peasants as they lost illusions in the provisional government. There was a party they could turn to. That's why all the attacks, the rabid attacks in the press against the Bolsheviks went on in that period. But you see, the economic situation is worsening now.
Yes.
In June, you have the inflation is increasing.
Yeah, prices are now 6.5 times 1913 prices.
That's right. But the position of the Soviets, Lenin has won over the Bolshevik Party to this position, but the position of the Soviets remained still support for the provisional government. So inside the Soviets, there's a battle between the Bolshevik wing and the others. And as I said, they're still a minority. Kerensky is determined in June to carry on with the offensive. And the Bolsheviks keep growing because of their principled opposition. But you see, when you say, they were divisive, they didn't want unity. No, they were standing out with a principled position, and they were offering the alternative, in the process growing.
Yes.
This is what is happening in this period. And particularly in Petrograd, they start to become a significant force within the Soviet. This is, in effect, the vanguard city of the Russian proletariat. And the role the Bolsheviks play in Petrograd will prove to be crucial in the whole revolution, because they're such a clear alternative with influence in the labor movement, although a minority.
Let's, if you'll indulge me, take another very brief aside to talk about the figure of Kerensky, Alexander Kerensky. He emerges initially as the Minister of Justice. Later on, he becomes the Minister of War, and that's the position he holds in June, which is why he's the one pushing for this offensive. So he was supposed to be a socialist, right? He was meant to be from the left.
That's how he's seen.
So what kind of a figure is Kerensky?
Well, Kerensky is your classic reformist who thinks that you can, first of all, no confidence in the socialist revolution, no understanding that this is preparing the social revolution. He sees this he as the bourgeois democratic revolution, the establishment of some kind of bourgeois democratic regime, which obviously entails accepting a capitalist class in power, and therefore having to compromise with them and carry out the needs of the bourgeoisie. In this moment, the war effort was a need of the bourgeois. So Kerensky is actually, in effect, becomes an agent of the ruling class inside the labor movement, because he still had influence. He still was a man of the Soviets, as well as being in the government. And he's playing a role that if the Bolshevik Party hadn't been present, Kerensky would go down in history as the man who betrayed the Russian Revolution. That's the figure he tried to. Whereas elsewhere, you have many Kerenskys that appear in history who do successfully betray the revolution because there isn't the equivalent of a Bolshevik Party. That's the role that Kerensky's playing.
So we're in the middle of June. Kerensky, Minister of War, is determined to carry on the offensive on the Eastern Front. But the Soviet Congress, the first Congress of all the Soviet deputies from around Russia, is scheduled to convene in June, and he delays it until after that Congress, which goes to show how powerful the Soviets were. What happens at that Congress?
Well, it's attended by over 1,000 delegates, nearly 800 with full votes. And as I said, the Soviets are still officially in support of the provisional government. In this conference, the Bolsheviks are a minority, and we look at the Soviet Congress delegates, just to give an idea of the balance. 285 socialist revolutionaries, 248 Mensheviks, and 105 Bolsheviks. That shows you the balance of forces within it. The leading Menshevik, Tsereteli, at the Soviet Congress says there is not one party today which would take power. But Lenin is there, and he shouts from the floor, "There is." And clearly the Bolsheviks are standing out. But as I said, the figures show the overwhelming majority for the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks here. And Kerensky here is where Kerensky is determined to carry out his offensive. In the meantime, the Bolsheviks are taking leading positions. They now control the majority of the workers' section of the Soviet in Petrograd, which is an important development. They're emerging as a force. Now, the Soviet Congress, there was pressure for a Bolshevik demonstration. The Soviet Congress moves to stop the Bolshevik demo.
This would have basically been a show of force,
It would have been a show of force, that's right. But now what happens in the end is we get to July, where the Bolsheviks have a dilemma they're facing. They understand how advanced the workers of Petrograd are. They now, in the workers' section at least, the Bolsheviks are a majority. So the workers are putting pressure on the leadership to act.
Yeah. We should say as well, just to preempt something that will become really important later, the Soviets was building up its own armed bodies of men. You had big workers' militias that had been established throughout the country with thousands of workers under arms that were prepared to defend the revolution by force.
You had garrisons going over.
Exactly, in their entirety.
Yeah. So it was the Soviet actually had an armed wing now. Here we see the role of leadership. The Bolsheviks understand one important question. Petrograd is the most advanced, let's say, point of the revolution. The rest of the country is still behind let's say, the consciousness of the masses in Petrograd. The Bolsheviks understand that if there's a premature attempt to take power in Petrograd, in the conditions of that moment, reaction could have found sufficient forces to crush Petrograd, and it would have been a defeat of the revolution. The crushing of the vanguard would have mean the end of the revolution. Let's put it from a Bolshevik point of view. And so, the Bolsheviks? What do? They put themselves at the head of the movement, but with the purpose of holding it within certain levels, i.e., not going to the point of actually challenging for power. A show of strength, and this is where what I wanted to quote is what actually happened on the day.
Go for it.
The 1st of July demonstration, and I'll quote: "The Congress of the Soviets itself organized an unarmed demonstration on July 1st. And that day became the day of our political triumph. The masses turned out in overwhelming numbers." And then he continues: "The workers and soldiers had inscribed on their banners and placards the demands and battle cries of our party. Quote, 'Down with the secret treaties. Down with the policy of strategic offensives. Long live an honorable peace. Down with the 10 capitalist ministers. All power for the Soviets.'" Trotsky says, "This demonstration proved not only to our opponents, but also to ourselves, that we were far stronger in Petrograd than had been imagined." It was a show of strength to the working class as a whole, but it also showed the party itself how deep its influence had seeped into the masses of Petrograd when the workers were coming out with all these banners with Bolshevik slogans. It was a warning to the bourgeois, the regime, to the government, how strong the Bolsheviks were becoming. This was no longer this small, marginal, extremist, sectarian force, as they like to call it. It had now become a significant section of the working class and had the leadership of an important section of the working class. And that marks a turning point in the situation. There's another side to it, of course. Having had to hold back from challenging for power, which would have been suicidal, they lead the demonstration, but are forced to bide their time, basically, to allow the process to develop across the country, whereby the balance of class forces would change in favor of the Bolsheviks. Because we have to remember, the Soviets were still in the hands of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. The Soviets were actually, in their leadership, were being used against the Bolsheviks and could have actually been used in a reactionary way. The Soviets could have actually turned out to be a force for reaction in the hands of these people. And in fact, the Soviet executive, after the 1st of July demonstration, accuses this demonstration of being counter-revolutionary, i.e. that they were working against the interests of the revolution. They were putting together interests of the revolution were push for the offensive and continue the war, which was a total contradiction. So there's a temporary retreat on the part of the leadership. This encourages reaction. And that's when all kinds of attacks now are unleashed publicly in the press, in the media, against Lenin and the Bolsheviks. This is when they start to really step up the campaign that he was a German spy. As I said, the revolution had to take a temporary, in effect, step back in this moment. And because Lenin was against the war, he was presented as being pro-Kaiser, as I said, a German agent, huge propaganda barrage against the Bolsheviks. And the Bolshevik leadership was still showing weakness. In the middle of July, the Bolshevik leaders meet. They met to discuss the new tactics proposed by Lenin. Of the 15 party leaders in attendance, 10 voted against the resolution of the adopted by the Central Committee. Lenin found himself, the next day, he was thoroughly alarmed of the way the party was moving. Because of the temporary weakening, they didn't understand the situation. They thought, we're now on the retreat. They're going to come for us. Mm-hmm. Again, here you see the superiority of Lenin, even in what seemed on the surface an extremely difficult position for the Bolsheviks. Lenin could see that the wave was moving towards the Bolsheviks. The process by which their influence was growing in city after city and Soviet after Soviet was continuing. So even in a difficult moment, Lenin could see in perspective what could come, and the necessity, therefore, of maintaining a principled stand, even suffering repression. Mm-hmm. This is when the Bolshevik leaders were starting to get arrested. This is when Lenin was forced into exile.
Yeah, he was against it initially, but he was
persuaded. Against it.
He was persuaded by the other Bolshevik leaders.
I think on that one, thank goodness, because they probably would have tried to kill Lenin at that particular moment.
Well, Lenin thought they would.
Yeah.
He even said, I think, in one of his correspondences after he fled, if they bump me off, here's some things I'm working on that maybe you can ensure get to the ranks. He
went into exile, into hiding in the underground in Finland, whereas the other leaders like Trotsky and others ended up in prison. That's when he writes State and Revolution. People think, well, in the middle of a revolution, here's Lenin dedicating time to a book, writing a book. Here we have to underline the question of theory. Why did he write a book called State and Revolution at this key moment in the revolution? Because an understanding of the state was absolutely necessary, because it was clear that the lack of understanding, particularly amongst the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries, but even within the wider movement, having illusions in the institutions of the state could have undermined the revolution itself. Lenin stresses in State and Revolution the nature of the bourgeois state and what is necessary to combat it. So he's writing this text. Now, the things continue to move on. The Bolsheviks are getting stronger. Kerensky is seeking a compromise, while Kornilov is preparing the counter-revolution.
Well, let's set this up a little bit. So Kerensky eventually this month takes over as prime minister. So he's head honcho now. He's still overseeing this disastrous offensive, which is falling apart. And a guy that we mentioned earlier, General Kornilov, takes over from General Brusilov as the head of the Russian armed forces. Mm-hmm. So he's now the main military man in the country. We should also say that this was the point where all of these slanders against the Bolsheviks appear in the press. A general arrest warrant goes out for all the leading members, including Lenin, and it's to the absolute shame of the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries, at least their right faction, that they all endorse this.
That's right.
They all come out saying that the Bolsheviks should be arrested as counter-revolutionaries, as German agents. They endorse all of these poisonous slanders from the bourgeois. But Trotsky puts out a statement where he says that he ought to be arrested as well because he endorses the Bolsheviks' position entirely, and they oblige, and he is arrested as a result of that. But it's worth emphasizing that because I've heard some people in the Stalinist tradition, even to this day, who argue that Trotsky only joined the Bolsheviks at the last minute when victory was assured. It was quite the opposite. He joined at a very dangerous time when all of the leading Bolsheviks were being arrested and thrown in jail. That's the point where Trotsky joined. He joined officially in August, but he's obviously about to join at this stage.
They had been working together,
Yeah.
de facto, since the revolution broke out. In actual fact, Lenin and Trotsky had the same analysis after February. Lenin had come round to the understanding that this was not going to be the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry.
Mm-hmm.
This was going to be workers' power, with the working class leading the revolution and getting the support of the peasantry.
Before we go into August, a quick word on slogans then, because throughout the revolution, the main slogan the Bolsheviks take up to resonate with the widest layer of the revolutionary masses is peace, so end Russia's involvement in the war, bread, win better conditions, end the hunger, and land. Deal with the land question.
For the peasants.
They've also had, since April, Lenin's slogan, since he won around the ranks of the Bolsheviks, all power to the Soviets.
Lenin starts to have doubts whether the Soviets will ever be won round. And he even looks at the lower down into the structures of the labor movement, the factory committees, for instance, which were in many cases ahead of the Soviets because they were much more reflective of the mood on the ground, because a factory committee can be changed quickly. The mood changes if necessary. You elect the more militant workers who represent that mood change. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Soviets still had a procedure where they'd been elected in the previous period. And even though they were much more flexible and much more elastic, say, than the bourgeois parliament, there was still some delay. So the leading bodies of the Soviets did not reflect the changing mood on the ground. So there was this moment in which what is going to be the instrument which leads the working class to power? And there was a question mark over the question of the Soviets. But meanwhile, the Bolshevik Party, 100,000 in mid-July. By the end of July, the figure, I think, is 175,000. The party's getting stronger and stronger in the workplaces, in the neighborhoods, amongst the soldiers, and a new situation is being prepared.
Well, let's move into August. What happened at this stage?
What happened at this stage is that Kornilov steps in. Kornilov attempts to launch his counter-revolution. Just going back to what you were saying about Trotsky and Lenin, there is Raskolnikov in his memoirs. He refers to, he says, Trotsky's attitude to Lenin was one of enormous esteem. He placed him higher than any contemporary he had met. No differences existed between the tactical line of Lenin and Trotsky. And then talking about Trotsky, he said, all of us old Leninists felt that he was ours. Mm-hmm. This was now, they come together as a force, Trotsky and Lenin. And it's in August, Trotsky in prison, Lenin in exile, that Kornilov launches counter-revolution. Kerensky now finds himself in a very tight corner because he wants to crush the revolution of the Bolsheviks, but he doesn't want to be crushed. And he sees in Kornilov, if Kornilov wins, he won't just crush the Bolsheviks, he'll destroy the whole democratic regime that emerged from the February Revolution. So Kerensky is actually forced to fight back. This is where, again, we see the superiority of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The Bolsheviks, even though they were in prison, right, then they were released as part of this process, they offered a united front to Kerensky on this question. They never abandoned their criticisms of him, but they put at the disposal of the defense of the revolution all the forces of the Bolsheviks.
Lenin has a great analogy where he says, we shall use Kerensky as a gun rest to fire at Kornilov in defense of the revolution.
That's right. And the Petrograd military defense is actually led by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks understand this is not the moment to turn your guns on Kerensky. This is the moment to unite to stop Kornilov. Because had Kornilov been victorious at that moment, we would now be discussing why the Russian Revolution was defeated, the role of Kerensky in betraying the revolution, the Kornilovite counter-revolution. And 1917 would be studied the way we study Germany in 1918 or 1923, the way we study China in 1926 or Spain in 1936 or Chile in 1973, i.e., it would be a defeated revolution, and we'd be discussing the lessons of that defeat and what should have been done. Instead, we're not studying that. We're actually studying what was done to avoid that defeat,
Yes.
which is the intelligent tactics of the Bolsheviks. They participated. Petrograd was led by the Bolsheviks. The Soviets were getting stronger. The workers fought back. At the end of August, 40,000 workers had joined the Petrograd Red Guards to defend the revolution against Kornilov. And therefore, the Kornilov attempt at a counter-revolutionary coup fails. That is a key moment in the revolution, because once that has failed, the immediate danger of reaction has been pushed back. The Bolsheviks are getting stronger in the Soviets, but still the Soviet executive was trying to hold back the revolution. And then we get to September.
Yeah, and we're entering the denouement. September 1917. Trotsky's busted out of jail on a modest bail of 3,000 rubles. And at this point, the Bolsheviks are hailed as the people who saved the revolution from Kornilov. Kerensky is in an even worse position. So what happens in September?
Well, the Petrograd Soviet, for example, now is fully Bolshevik. The leadership of the working class in that important city is Bolshevik. The Soviet executive meets in early September.
Yeah, September the 9th, I believe.
And it's the first time that we see a Bolshevik majority on a resolution. There was a vote in the Soviet executive to sanction the policies of Kerensky. Right, this is clearly a break with Kerensky.
Yeah,
and the way the vote goes is interesting. For the coalition, that is for the government, 414 against 519 with 67 abstentions. It was a resounding victory for a Bolshevik position, which was a clear turning point.
Yeah.
In the situation.
It's a vote of no confidence in the provisional government by the Petrograd executive.
That's right. So you can see things are accelerating. Events. The Kornilov coup has had its effect. It's like a warning to the working class. You cannot trust this ruling class. You don't take firm measures against these people. They're going to turn on you. They're going to destroy the revolution. So things are moving. There's a Bolshevik Central Committee.
Yeah, 20th September.
That takes place. They agree to participate in what was called the pre-parliament. It was a coalition with bourgeois forces. Lenin and Trotsky were actually for boycotting it. But they went ahead. But within it, Lenin fights for his position. He's exasperated by the way the CC is delaying taking serious action. He actually threatens to resign at this point.
Yes.
Lenin realizes that we've got to boycott the pre-parliament. We can't participate in any of this. And he can see the impending revolution is here.
Yeah. In his mind, at this point, the task is to organize the workers, organize the masses for the overthrow of Kerensky.
That's
and
right.
participating in this farce of a pre-parliament would be effectively an endorsement of the continuation of the provisional government.
Exactly, a bourgeois institution.
Yeah.
So it's resolved in the end. The Bolsheviks, their tactic is they participate, but then they walk out. They turn their backs on it. That is an important tactical thing to send a message to the masses. No trust in this body. And that's when we get to the month of October.
All right, well, put it on the board. The big month, Red October. So, what's the situation here? What kind of strength do the Bolsheviks have? What kind of plans are underway?
Well, more and more Soviets, local Soviets, are passing over to the Bolsheviks. The factory committees are supporting the Bolsheviks, even sections of the trade unions. And the masses in general, there's a massive wave now towards the Bolshevik Party. It's quite clear. This is a key moment in history which shows This actually highlights the importance of the Revolutionary Party. It's quite clear here that the masses are drawing revolutionary conclusions. They've been through all of this experience that we've just outlined.
Mm-hmm.
They've seen the threat of counter-revolution. They've seen the threat of a bloody putting down of the revolution by Kornilov, successfully defeated by whom? The Bolsheviks played a key role. They've seen through Kerensky and all his maneuvers, and the workers are moving towards revolutionary conclusions. The great thing about the October 1917 is the presence of the Bolshevik Party, with its now hundreds of thousands of members, and with a leadership under Lenin and Trotsky that were in harmony with the mood of the masses. And you see workers' militias, they count in their ranks now between 70 and 100,000.
And there's a body called the MRC, the Military Revolutionary Committee.
That's set up on the eve of the revolution, practically.
Yes, at the initiative of Trotsky, I believe.
Yes, and Lenin sends a letter to the Central Committee urging them to decide on the seizure of power. He says, the moment has come.
Yeah.
You've got to decide the day of the insurrection. Now, the Soviet executive, the leadership of the Soviets, is still narrowly Menshevik and social revolutionary. It still has that majority. But the factories are with the Bolsheviks. The working class is moving towards the Bolsheviks. Now, on the 10th of October, there's a secret strategy meeting held by members of the Bolshevik Central Committee in Smolny. And that's where Lenin calls for the immediate uprising. The moment has come to strike. Everybody sides with Lenin except Zinoviev and Kamenev. This is the famous Central Committee where two key leading Bolsheviks vacillate at a key moment.
I would also throw in that Stalin says nothing.
That's right. He sits in the background. It's the famous meeting where the big majority, obviously, with Lenin, the Central Committee.
So this is the Bolshevik Central Committee.
That's right. It organizes a meeting, and Lenin defends the October 10th resolution, and he says the masses have given the Bolsheviks their trust and demand from them not words but deeds. And he says power must be seized immediately, at once. Every day lost could be fatal. History will not forgive us if we do not take power now. This is the key moment, and the CC endorses this position.
2 days later, on the 18th of October, Kamenev, even though the Central Committee has endorsed the 10th of October resolution, publishes a declaration against an uprising.
That's right.
So he essentially breaks the party line in a public newspaper, and Lenin is furious, and this is where he pushes to have Kamenev and Zinoviev kicked out of the party.
Well, they endanger the revolution. The key decision, and you're putting it out in public, that the insurrection is being prepared. It's important to understand that there was a discussion here about obviously winning over the Soviets to this position, because obviously the Soviets were the democratically elected bodies, the councils of the workers, etc. To have the backing of the Soviet, obviously, would give you enormous authority. But Lenin and Trotsky, they understood that it's not enough just to get a resolution passed at the Soviets. You've got to prepare it. You've got to have the garrisons prepared. You've got to have the soldiers prepared. You've got to have the workers in the factories prepared. So when that decision is taken, everything has to be in place to act very quickly, because the bourgeois were furious. They were organizing. They were mobilizing their forces. There was a barrage in the press against the Bolsheviks. Everything was being done to try and destroy the Bolsheviks as they were expanding and growing and starting to become the leadership that was going to lead this revolution. Trotsky speaks to the soldiers, and he urges them to take power. He understands, obviously, the role of the garrisons in the hands of the Bolsheviks. The Petrograd Soviet now endorses the Military Revolutionary Committee, which is basically the general staff running the military side of the revolution. Kerensky can see in the Military Revolutionary Committee the threat to his power, to bourgeois power. He tries to crush the committee, but obviously fails. He gathers troops to try and crush it, but he hasn't got enough forces. the revolution is too powerful, it's surging forward. And then you have the second All-Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd.
Yeah, on the 24th of October.
That's right. Now, this is where the majority appears. The Soviets, in effect, are constantly being renovated through elections in workplaces, elections in the local areas, and a majority emerges on the Soviet for the Bolshevik position, which is the Soviets should take power. Kerensky and the general staff, they're pushing for the Military Revolutionary Committee to be arrested. And Kerensky appeals to the pre-parliament to mobilize, to destroy the Military Revolutionary Committee. And the Mensheviks are desperate to stop this process unfolding, to stop the revolution from unfolding. But in spite of all the efforts of Kerensky, the Mensheviks and the others, the revolution continues to rumble forward under the leadership of the Bolsheviks. Here we have the Winter Palace, which is this symbol of bourgeois democratic power. Let's put it that way. It's defenseless, and the revolution is moving forward.
And the reason it's defenseless is because there's nobody prepared to defend it.
That's right. All the regiments, they're all swinging to the Bolsheviks.
I think from what I remember reading in John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, which I also recommend and will link in the description, the provisional government was forced to rely on in its defence essentially like a youth brigade, so a bunch of reactionary Boy Scouts and one reactionary women's division, both of which more or less surrendered without a fight when it came down to it.
There were groups of cadets, young cadets, that tried to use arms and to resist. But the force of the power that now had built up around the Soviet, led by the Bolsheviks, was such that, for instance, the Aurora ship under the Military Revolutionary Committee sails up and threatens the cadets openly.
Under the control of the famous Kronstadt sailors.
That's right. They were very loyal to the Soviets. They occupied the state banks. They took over the telephones, etc. Power was being taken over systematically. And they discuss what they're going to call the new government at this stage. Lenin proposes that it be called the Council of People's Commissars, which is what it becomes known as. The sailors backed the revolution. And then they discuss the plans to take the Winter Palace. With the legitimacy now of the Russian Congress of the Soviets, they move.
Let's talk about that majority again quickly, though, because the reason the Bolsheviks have a majority of that Congress is because they ally themselves with the left wing of the Social Revolutionaries.
That's right.
So can we talk about that quickly? Because the Social Revolutionaries was a bit of a strange beast.
Well, the Social Revolutionaries, as you said earlier, they went back to a tradition, the Nordics, populists, etc. But in the process of the revolution, the Social Revolutionaries underwent different pressures. A left wing and a right wing emerged. The right wing were openly collaborating with Kerensky, with the bourgeois. The left, because the left were based more on the proletarian elements, they were actually gravitating towards the Bolsheviks. In fact, they collaborated, they cooperated. There was even a point where they were offered joint government, the Social Revolutionaries. Now, this is where the question of the Winter Palace is discussed. The defences, as you said, have folded. And there's no resistance to the Military Revolutionary Committee. It is so powerful because there is such huge mass support for it that the taking of the Winter Palace actually proves to be a very easy operation because, as you said, there's no one left to defend it.
Well, it's part of the reason that bourgeois historians try to claim that the October Revolution was a coup. They use the fact that it was so smooth and so apparently seamless to suggest that it was all just a conspiracy of a small number of men under the control of Lenin and Trotsky.
But it's not true because the party had hundreds of thousands of members by now. and the backing of millions. You could not have had such a powerful movement taking power for the working class if you describe it as a coup. A coup is not a revolution. A coup is a plot by a small minority maneuvering with military forces against the majority. The coups that we've known, the Pinochet coup of 1973, that's a coup, not the October Revolution. The October Revolution was millions of workers led by the Bolshevik Party, winning a majority in the Soviets and declaring the taking of power. That's what it was. And now, what happens now is the key moment in which power has passed to the Soviets in Petrograd. That's not the end of the revolution. That is the first step, but it's the beginning of the building of the new regime.
So I'd like to end this history of the revolutionary year 1917 with a quote from Pravda published on the morning of the Russian Revolution. It says, "They wanted us to take the power alone, so that we alone should have to contend with the terrible difficulties confronting the country. So be it. We take the power alone, relying upon the voice of the country and counting upon the friendly help of the European proletariat." That's important because it goes to show that Lenin was thinking that the fate of the Russian Revolution was tied inexorably to the European and world revolution.
Can I just add a couple of little points? Since 1917, we have had many Februaries. Germany, Italy, Germany 1918, Italy 1920, China 1926, Spain in the 30s, Italy again 1945. Today, Nepal has had its February. Indonesia, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. We have had numerous Februaries, i.e., moments in which the masses have surged and brought down governments, brought down presidents, prime ministers who've had to flee. The problem is, there's not been an October to follow these Februaries. What was the difference? Well, we've described the role of the Bolshevik Party in this podcast. The crucial role that a revolutionary party can play in gathering together the advanced layers of the working class as a force to lead the society forward in overthrowing the old system. Today we have the Februaries. What we need to do is prepare for the Octobers. The way to do that is build that revolutionary party that's missing. If you're interested in discussion, think of joining us as well.
Absolutely. And obviously a revolutionary party is nothing without revolutionary theory. And we've quoted a number of texts that have helped us to prepare for this episode over the course of it. I've linked them all in the description. But our main bookshop, Well Read Books, is a treasure trove of fantastic texts about the Russian Revolution, Alan Wood's Bolshevism, History of the Bolshevik Party, our new biography of Lenin, published last year. There are many, many, many texts that deal with this greatest event in human history. And the reason we say that, it's not to be trite or to bombastically overstate things. This was the first time in history that ordinary people seized power, but more importantly, held on to power. And it was as a consequence of the patient work the Bolsheviks performed, not just in the course of January to October, but in the more than a decade, almost 2 decades prior. Lenin's patient work to build up the small forces to eventually create a revolutionary party capable of leading the masses of Russia to victory. And where in early days, when it comes to building the embryo of such an organization in the Revolutionary Communist International, but hopefully on the basis of this episode, you'll understand the importance of creating that revolutionary party and you'll join us in the most important task facing humanity today. So, that was episode 1 of our new season. We'll be back every week for the next 7 weeks with new episodes of the Spectre of Communism podcast on YouTube and also everywhere else you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, etc. We're going to be dealing with other revolutions from history. We're going to be taking questions from our viewers, dealing with some fundamental matters of theory and philosophy and history. And we're also going to be performing some deep dives into some of our classic pieces of Marxist theory. So stay tuned for all of that. Fred, that was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for taking us through the revolutionary year of 1917.
My pleasure.
And I'll say goodbye for now and see you all next week.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist.
Communism. The communist.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.